Over the past year, this channel has extensively covered how socioeconomic issues have been degrading the citizen experience, and more recently, our videos have explored how to channel our instincts, desires, and urges. And that's why our focus today is on overcoming a common obstacle that often stands in the way of our goals: the confusion between suffering and emotional bonds. If we look closely, the way we form emotional connections is based on a binary limitation. We often only manage to connect through a shared object that acts as a unifying bridge. The problem is that this object functions in a very mechanical way, constantly shifting between being a source of suffering or a source of pleasure. It's almost like a switch that inhibits other potential interests. In other words, we only stick with people because we find in them a shared object of pain or a shared object of pleasure. So, the goal of today's video is to provide ways to move beyond this basic form of relationship, and in doing so, we build a better system of interaction, all with the aim of enhancing our lived experience. We know that modernity tends to create groups and a kind of false individualism. Actually, I don't even think we should use the word individualism, because there's no real individuation in modernity. It's really a collectivism based on certain identities, which are created through that binary model I mentioned, an object that only has two modes: a shared object of suffering or a shared object of pleasure. The problem is that this has led to a robotic tendency where almost everyone wants to feel connected to others, but not because they are interested in what makes another person's experience unique, but because they want to connect through a basic framework that assumes everyone's experience is exactly the same. For example, people here don't like me for what makes me different. They didn't follow me because they liked me. They followed because they liked the shared object of suffering that supposedly linked us. It was a major mistake on my part not to have realized this in the channel's early years, because this form of interaction is the most basic of all. It's what makes someone cry in a sad movie where the protagonist's dog dies. The problem gets even worse when this object itself is a one-sided illusion. Would people still be interested in the real me separate from the object they've created as a binary mechanism for shared suffering? That is the true test of the strength of an interaction, of a connection that goes beyond the superficial. The same goes for interactions based solely on a shared object of pleasure. But I'm not saying this can exist. They need to coexist with forms of interest that don't operate in a such binary way. If someone is only interested in you because of your suffering, which in their view is also their suffering, then the day the suffering ends, so does the interest. Likewise, if the shared object of pleasure disappears, the interest vanishes as well. This pattern, while selfish, remains at an overly predictable level, and it worsens when trends create a super shared object of suffering or pleasure. This leads masses of people to delude themselves into thinking they are living the same context, that they share the same objects of suffering or pleasure, or that they are altruistically interested in each other. But for that to be true, they would have to be interested in each other even without a supermediating object, and the connection would have to function even when it's not based on pain or pleasure. This explains a lot about why people aren't really happy in groups. That state is rare precisely because it's a non-binary object. So, my goal isn't to annihilate these objects, but to allow for a self-referential value system to exist beyond this mechanical utilitarianism. And I'm going to explain exactly what I mean right now. Before we move forward with my proposal, we need to remember the origin of these searches. Why so many men and women seek the core of their lives in these objects? Well, basically, everyone wants to feel safe, not necessarily in a physical sense, though indirectly that's part of it, but they want safety in their own minds. That is, they want the assurance that there are other people living through the same turmoil, the same state of mental collapse. This is similar to the psychological tendency of creating scapegoats for one's problems, like socialists blaming capitalism or feminists blaming men. But what happens on a mass scale is the creation of a suffering model based on the illusion of a shared object, like the suffering of men or the suffering of women. But have you ever noticed that it's impossible for everyone to suffer in exactly the same way, for the same reasons, at the same time? That would require all suffering to be identical and every life to be in the same state due to the same object. The truth is, this is a mental construct. At best, we are facing similar difficulties, but we are not living through exactly the same experiences. So, we must replace the safety through suffering with safety through strength. Suffering will always exist, and it was never the real problem. The real issue is the object itself, the attempt to universalize the same suffering for everyone and create a mass of sufferers. Instead, you will have your own suffering, and your security will no longer come from the suffering of others, because their suffering is not yours. From now on, your suffering will come from your strength and also contribute to your sense of security. In my view, strength is the only thing that can make you truly feel secure. Even though absolute security doesn't really exist, that's another illusion. Confidence in your own power is what gives you that feeling, and it will extend as far as you allow it to do. Indeed, my perspective retains a utilitarian aspect, but not in the way its predecessors imagined. The difference is that I'm more concerned with myself or with the individual subject when considering others, in the sense of promoting a better experience. However, I firmly reject the idea of a shared object as a universal structure of suffering, because in my view, it's impossible to properly internalize different elements as if they were the same. Knowing this, I want to place even greater emphasis on context and on the relationship between egoic selves rather than on the emotional clamor of sufferers who only feel pain for others. This is a way to challenge both supposed altruism and supposed utilitarianism. The utility of something must serve a higher interest so that the experience itself can expand, and within that expanded scope, there is room for both the basic and the complex. This brings greater freedom. The individual subject really gains more substance in my proposal, and they can be whatever they want, moralist, immoral, sacred, profane, I don't care, because there is no object tethering me to them. I am my own with my own elements. But then you might be wondering, how on earth will people interact? Doesn't this make it impossible? On the contrary, what I'm doing is precisely saving interactions. Mechanical interactions are automatic, unthinking, lived in haste. True relations will emerge through a balance of egos, like a friendly competition among gods. In this view, the romantic or more melancholic aspects are the result of an intensification of this competition between egos, or rather, the balance between egos of elevated spirit. This is a far better version for supplanting Stirner's nihilistic approach, which to me was overly utilitarian and sought a kind of association of egoists. I don't agree and I don't find much appeal in modernist cynicism. Instead of that practice, I prefer to promote a more encanting approach, but ironically with my kind of love. It's almost an aesthetic experience of loving opposition and difference. Well, by this point, I've probably already dismantled a whole pile of modern problems, but here's another one I intend to solve. At the very least, destabilize. You see, nowadays people want to have ownership over everyone's relationships. Everyone preaches about the love of others as if it were their own property. But that's a lie, a boogeyman. The truth is, what's being promoted isn't love, but the utilitarian actions of individuals. That is, their public individualism, which is merely collectivism in disguise. Love is something relational. Even great artists only manage to capture a part of it in their romantic works. Always just a fragment is revealed precisely because it is my property. In my view, love is a relational property belonging to its bearers and cannot be replicated in a utilitarian way. Only utilitarianism can be replicated. But the moment you turn it public, it becomes something else. What defines love is precisely the complex, fragmented interaction between those who carry it. People try to measure love as if it were the distance between two objects, when in reality it's a vast interactive complex, contextual, confusing, contradictory, and often maddening. It's arrogant to presume what is happening in the minds of two or three people. It is the same as trying to predict which fingers I will raise before I raise them. In a way, love has indeed been desacralized, but it has also been transformed into this utilitarian object of suffering for the masses, and this has only worsened the propaganda about love. This means that people talk a lot about love but live very little of it. In other words, they are all liars. They don't care about love as the real experience of the individual. The current subdivisions, romantic, sexual, sacrificial, are, in fact, mechanisms of evasion. They allow people to talk about love without ever confronting its intrinsically elusive nature. In reality, love is an agonistic dynamic, where the subjects, far from dissolving to a whole, assert their singularity through mutual challenge. True intimacy resides not in the transcendence of the ego, but in its sovereign affirmation within a play of forces that demands and refines the autonomy of each part. And I know this is rare to find, but this occurs not only between objects, but also between experiences. It is only through this that one can learn to love one's own fate and to love the eternal return with all of its peculiarities.